We are back, finally, with the Taylor Swift discography analysis series, and today we are tackling just two albums, Folklore and Evermore. I always wanted to do a video focused on just these two albums and really analyzing them in depth, and so I figured that would be the perfect part 3 for this series because, that's where we left off. And especially because, as I've talked about before, these two albums really feel like their own chapter within Taylor Swift's career. These are arguably her two most profound and well-written poetic albums to date. There's a ton to unpack, and honestly, I'll admit it was kind of difficult. I think there's a lot of ways you can interpret these albums, so I just did my best. Also, at the time of recording this, we just hit 5,000 subscribers, which is really cool. Thank you guys so much. And we're just gonna get right into it. This is my deep dive analysis into Folklore and Evermore. Let's just start with some overall notes on these albums and how I'm going to be discussing them. Previously, I really focused on using the dramatic plot structure to analyze Taylor Swift's albums, as I did in part 1 and 2, which you should definitely go watch if you haven't already. The reason being, I really believe Taylor's album construction relies on the album as a whole, telling one cohesive story, while each song conveys mini scenes or vignettes of that story. And thus, utilizing a typical plot structure would help us analyze the story of the whole album by placing certain songs into certain key moments. For example, track 1 being the opening exposition, track 5 being the inciting incident, the closing track being the resolution, and so on. Again, more on that in those other videos. But that's not really going to work this time around. The main reason being that Folklore and Evermore aren't really trying to tell one larger story throughout the runtime from start to finish, necessarily. Rather, they are intentionally designed to be collections of stories, anthologies, very similar to, her most recent album. In fact, I always kind of viewed Lover as the end of Taylor Swift's journey as a person, at least until things broke down again. But at that point, Lover kind of felt like the end of her journey. And then Folklore and Evermore became this little chapter where she grew more focused on her artistry, on her storytelling, and her poetry.
There was a point where I got to as a writer who only wrote very diaristic songs that I felt it was unsustainable from my future moving forward.
These are conceptual albums, weaving various different stories into each other, and that each supplement and create some overall idea and concept. And so that's what we're going to be trying to analyze here. More importantly, both of these albums were born directly out of the pandemic. In fact, that is why they really stand out as their own duology within her whole discography. Up until that point and after that point, Taylor Swift had been and has been doing full album cycles, releasing promotional singles months in advance, teasing song titles, and releasing albums tied to her own personal life experiences with tours and music videos. Once COVID hit though, all that got thrown out the window. And so, through the pandemic came an almost entirely new Taylor Swift. She said herself a big focus while writing these albums was just letting her imagination run wild, coming up with fantastical stories born out of the loneliness and isolation of the pandemic. She watched a lot of movies, she read a lot, of course having more time to do that kind of stuff due to the pandemic, as I think a lot of people can relate to. As she kept coming up with images and characters, those characters eventually turned into stories, and those stories eventually turned into songs. And while these are largely things said about Folklore, Evermore being the sister album has that exact same feeling. Both albums have the same woodlands aesthetic, the same manner of just being surprise dropped onto her fans rather than having big promotional cycles, the same overall vibe and indie fireplace production style, the same usage of poetic techniques, and the same mixture of autobiographical and non-autobiographical storytelling that doesn't really have one cohesive storyline all the way through, but rather weaves multiple storylines together. Those are really the key elements of these albums that make analyzing them a little bit trickier, but honestly, all the more fascinating. It's all very similar to what I said about the Tortured Poets Department anthology back when I analyzed that. In fact, I called that album Folklore and Evermore's third sister album, and when I analyzed that, I ended up splitting the tracks into 3 acts, each with a distinct theme that's kind of all brought together at the end. And so I think Folklore and Evermore do similar things, but instead of trying to pick out a structure and jam the album into that, I think it might be more worthwhile to just go through the albums track by track and see what motifs and themes we parse out as we listen to the music, as we go through these lyrics, and then try to put that together at the end, kind of like what I did with TTPD. There's of course still significance to the ordering of tracks, there's still meaning in what is the opener, what's the closer, what is track 5. All those things still stand that I've said this entire series, it's just a little bit different this time around. So let's get into it. A good title goes a long way, and I think with Folklore, the title tells us a lot in that this album's title doesn't really appear anywhere in this album. There's no title track. It just kind of stands as its own representation of everything that's about to come. Another key time she did this was with Reputation, which was very clearly about her reputation. And I think similarly, this title is pretty explicit about what this album is about. Folklore is defined as the traditional beliefs, customs, and stories of a community, passed through the generations by word of mouth. That's really interesting to think about and can guide everything we go through because the emphasis here is on storytelling. Whether those are her own stories or not doesn't matter. It's about creating traditions and stories that, as she herself says, can be passed down like folk songs and let the love last so long. So let's go track by track and see what we can parse. And to start, I actually think it would be useful to go over the opener and the closer at the same time. The opener to this album, is an almost kind of uplifting way to start off the album. It's not necessarily happy, since it's lamenting the loss of a valued relationship, but it's not doing so in a dramatic, angry way like with State of Grace, for example, which opened red. It's more nonchalant and passive, saying it would have been fun if this worked out, but it didn't. And that's okay. Simultaneously, this album closes on Hoax, which kind of feels like the sheer opposite. There, she laments, "My only one, my kingdom come undone." An interesting callback to the opener, now saying this was her only chance at happiness, love, whatever it might be, but it's gone. And it broke her, it tore her apart. But at the same time, this is what she wants. She wants the shade of blue. She wants to sit in this sadness, similar to The One. It's a very complex track, as Taylor herself talked about.
With this song being the last song on the album, it kind of embodied all the things that this album was thematically, like confessions, incorporating nature, emotional volatility and ambiguity at the same time, sort of love that isn't just easy.
And the definition of the word hoax is particularly interesting. It's a humorous or malicious deception. So there's kind of this sense of laughing it off in this track. Again, tying back to The One, even though it's more devastating, she's still kind of like, damn, that really just happened. It's a hoax, it's just a prank. Like, she acknowledges that it's silly, that she shouldn't feel this way, but she still does, you know? I think that's kind of what this track is saying. When you think about The One as the opener and Hoax as the closer, I think it brings up two important motifs we're going to notice throughout this entire album. First of all is escapism, which I think is pretty apparent, but it's definitely one of the key pieces of glue tying this entire album together. Escapism is all about seeking distraction from unpleasant situations. Essentially, taking things lightly, brushing them off by going to new worlds, creating new ideas. This is a common theme throughout a lot of Taylor Swift's music, but I think it's especially prevalent here, not just because of the lyrics, but because this album was quite literally born as an escapist album. She herself said her pen, her imagination was her form of escapism during the start of isolation, during COVID, which was a very scary time. So instead of worrying about those issues, why not create a character you can dwell on? Why not dream up a story that solves those issues for you, even if they aren't actually solved in real life? I do think that's kind of the sentiment set up in the opening track and resolved in Hoax. I think the best tracks that get at this theme of escapism are toward the middle of the album. First, Mirrorball, which is the only track to really explicitly talk about COVID.
It also is the first time, and one of the only times that the time that we're living through was actually lyrically addressed.
And how in that moment of loneliness, you can still be trying to impress someone, you can still try to get attention because, again, it's better to try, it's better to escape and do something with yourself than to just be stuck, than to just accept things for what they are almost, you know? Obviously that being a big motif in This Is Me Trying, her spiraling out of herself and saying, at least she's trying to make something out of it. Then we have 7, which is, I think, the most escapist track on this album, considering it literally is an escape to childhood, a time of innocence. One of my favorite lyrics in this song is, "I think your house is haunted, your dad is always mad, and that must be why." A truly tragic situation, but because this is told from the perspective of the child, the abuse of the father is covered up in this innocent childlike light. And I think that's a brilliant demonstration of escapism through the art of storytelling. In a way, August is also a form of escapism on the part of Inez, or Augustine, or whatever you want to call her. Her summer fling with James, talked about in the song, is a form of escapism. Since she knew it was wrong, she knew it was temporary, but she went for it anyways to have that fleeting moment of joy. And now she she has to live with the consequences of never being able to get that back. Similar to illicit affairs, a moment of escape before you have to sit with the consequences. Later in Epiphany, the titular lyric, only 20 minutes to sleep, but you dream of some epiphany. This is exactly, again, a drawn up picture of escaping tragic realities for a moment, getting, as she says, a glimpse of some relief. So that's kind of the escapism side of the album. The other key motif that I think we can establish is the juxtaposition between happiness and sadness. Something interesting to think about is how pretty much all of Taylor Swift's albums up till this point have ended on positive, uplifting notes. Very intentionally, of course, trying to resolve the conflicts and tensions of their respective albums. This is pretty much an entire 180 flip on that, ending the album on a questioning, uncertain, somber note. And I think to me that represents the idea that stories don't always have happy endings. So how else is that idea shown throughout this album? Take a look at the opening tracks now. We go straight from The One, a nonchalant, whimsical track laughing off what could have been, to Cardigan, a serious, angry, reminiscent track mourning over, well, the same thing. What could have been. How this guy, James, could have been the one, but he messed it up in all these different ways. Earlier, she resists the temptation to ask what could have been. Now, she kind of revels in that misery, declaring profoundly how she knows more than people give her credit for. Then we have The Last Great American Dynasty, ending on a note of victory and pride, having a marvelous time ruining everything, into Exile, a track about how everything is ruined, and she is not in fact having a marvelous time. Later in the album as well, we jump around a lot between happier tracks like Invisible String and Betty, to angrier tracks like Mad Woman, to more introspective tracks like Epiphany and Peace. Again, these aren't necessarily all stories from her own life ordered in a way to take you on some emotional journey like Red or Reputation. In fact, we know for sure there is an entirely fictional storyline embedded into the album. But the specific juxtaposition of playing with your emotions still feels very intentional. Again, I think very in line with the ultimate theme of storytelling here. When you have a collection of stories like this, it's not all going to have the same tone. It's not all going to pull from the same narrative or have a happy ending. It's going to jump around quite a bit. If you ever had to read anthologies growing up of short stories, like, it's exactly like that. The specific phrase Taylor herself uses to describe this motif in the album is emotional volatility. I just love that phrase. I think it's great. And I think it's very true to what's going on here. So we have these two key themes, escapism and emotional volatility. And in a way, we've kind of touched on all the tracks in the album and how they fit in, except for one we still need to talk about, which is very, very important if you've watched my previous analyses, so don't worry, we're getting there. Before that though, I want to ask, why are these themes of storytelling, escapism, and emotional volatility important, and how do they come together? Remember, with her previous albums, the themes and motifs we pulled out had to do with Taylor's personal journey as a human, going through relationships, going through heartbreak and grief. But I don't think that's really the case here, though. Again, Taylor Swift is kind of done with her personal journey, at least at this point in time. These themes we've pulled out have to do more with Taylor's own beliefs about the art of storytelling itself, for all the reasons I set up before. This is an album dedicated to storytelling. It's fictional. It was born out of isolation and the pandemic, drawn out in this really beautiful, poetic fireplace manner. And this whole time, she's telling us two important things about storytelling based on the two motifs established. Storytelling is a form of escapism, and storytelling is emotionally volatile. And importantly, she's kind of supporting both of those things through her love for storytelling, through the creation of this album even. Yes, there are consequences to your escapism. Yes, there are consequences to being emotionally volatile. But oftentimes it's important to let yourself dream, to let yourself imagine, to feel the highs and lows. Storytelling is important. And what seals the deal on all of this for me is the most critical track on this album, like I said, track 5, My Tears Ricochet.
I mean, to me, the whole thing starts with My Tears Ricochet.
Yeah, chronologically, that's the first thing. I wrote that one alone, and it's definitely, I think, one of the saddest songs on the album.
This is a song all about her struggle to own her music. And I think in an album all about storytelling, this works well as kind of an inciting incident, setting up that central conflict the way her track 5s in previous albums did as well. The reason being, this is the track where Taylor demonstrates to us why storytelling is so important to her. In this song, she goes very into detail on how miserable and angry it made her that her music was essentially taken from her, and why that just meant so much to her, why it hurt her. Her music was her home. Her partnership with her label for the longest time was her home. This music has always meant the world to her, and having those rights and ownership taken away from her goes so much deeper than business. It's about the years and years of her own stories themselves being lost.
From a psychological perspective, what you do to an artist when you separate them from their work. You break something.
That is why she could not go with Grace. That's why she creates this funeral scene. And most importantly, this is something y'all need to hear. That is why she is fighting so hard to retain those stories and go through with the entire re-recording project. Why her tears end up ricocheting back to him and hurting him. And I think the ultimate theme here being that storytelling is important might seem kind of simplistic. You already know that storytelling is important. Like, why else do we listen to music? But I think establishing that is still so critical, especially in a time like the pandemic, in times like now where there's just a lot of stress going around, a lot of uncertainty about the state of affairs. Not getting too far into that, but I think it's nice to come back to this idea that escaping, telling stories, making music, these things matter. Even if it seems silly, even if it seems unproductive, it truly does matter. It helps us. It keeps us human. It keeps us grounded. It keeps us from going insane in our isolation. I think ultimately that is what folklore is about. That's what she's trying to tell us. And I think that's why it appealed to so many people. It was a glimmer of what can come out of isolation. It was showing people that you can still do things that are meaningful to you and meaningful to other people, even when we're isolated and stuck. So yeah, that's what I make of folklore. Don't know how much sense all that made, but we're just gonna get into the next one. With folklore, I started off with the importance of the title, and I want to do the same here because not only is the title track of this album the closer, meaning there is definitely significance to it, I think this word is also just really interesting. Evermore isn't really a common word in English. It's intentionally poetic. In fact, one of the most popular usages of this word is in the famous poem The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Specifically, he uses nevermore, though I mean, that conjunction of words is still the same. And I think it's an interesting parallel, possibly intentional, who's to say, but The Raven is a poem having to do with loneliness and grief and how dark memories can pretty much stay with you forever, how some things just never change or fade no matter how much you want them to. And honestly, I think that's exactly the theme of Evermore by Taylor Swift. Take a song like Coney Island, which is a beautiful parallel to The Raven, following someone who sits lonely on a bench in Coney Island, wondering where things went wrong, lamenting on all these things both the narrator and these ex-partners did wrong, and ultimately just having to sit with it on that bench, almost paralyzed in those memories. That's kind of the emotion that lingers throughout this entire album, this deep, profound sense of time, which I believe and argue is really the key theme of this album.
Evermore deals a lot in endings of all sorts, shapes and sizes, all the kinds of ways we can end, and the pain that goes along with that, the phases of it.
And remember, she still keeps the same overall elements as folklore. She's still weaving autobiographical and non-autobiographical stories together. This was still a surprise drop. There's still sister albums, all that. But I think what she does is she takes the emotional volatility of folklore and the escapism even one step further. And that's because in folklore, she's already established the art of storytelling as something beautiful and important. Again, that was the theme, right? So she doesn't really need to do that anymore. Now, she can let another theme take focus. So let's see how that works. The opening track, Willow, is I think fairly similar to a lot of her earlier albums, many of which open on uplifting relationship positive notes. Think of Mine or Fearless or even Ready for It, songs like that. Willow is also very positive, but with its own spin. There's a key idea set up in this song that plays throughout the entire album of control. I think that's going to be one of our important motifs here. And really what I mean by that is having control over your destiny and fate. Willow sets up the idea that sometimes you don't have control. Sometimes you don't even want to have control over your own fate and destiny. This is set up with the metaphor of the willow and how it, quote, bent right to your wind. This pull that this man had on her was almost entirely out of her control. She was bent in that direction from the sadness, which is commonly associated with willows, into a state of happiness and joy that carries on throughout the whole song. I'm begging for you to take my hand, wreck my plans, that's my man. So now not only is this change happening without her control, she wants it to. She wants him to maneuver her fate and wreck her plans. There's also a sense of finality and even urgency in this song, like, take me in your arms, take me on this journey, I'm ready, I want it. Then we flip, and quite literally it's a 180 flip into Champagne Problems, another song about having your plans wrecked, but in the totally opposite sense, now that being a marriage proposal having gone wrong. What's interesting is we get this from the perspective of the person doing the wreckage. And I think it still is in a way out of her control too. The bridge really is what explains that. Despite everything they've gone through, all the great things he's done for her, the highs and lows of this relationship, in a split second it all changed because it just didn't feel right. Sometimes you just don't know the answer till someone's on their knees and asks you. The title of the song intentionally belittles that grief, calling these problems just champagne problems, but I think the irony is intentional here too. He might perceive this as just hurting him, but really, it hurt her too. Her fate has been changed, and now she just again has to sit with that grief. And then again, we flip 180 into Gold Rush, back to that happy, uplifting, let me into your arms, I want you to take control kind of feeling. A gold rush is something you have to get to immediately. Think about the gold rush of 1849 in California. It's a metaphor for urgency, how she's kind of dropping everything to be with this person, whether it's in her control or not. So again, there's a sense of longing and wanting things to last, but also wanting to let fate just kind of do its thing and take you where it wants. 'Tis the Damn Season is a little tricky here. I think you can analyze it to have the same sense of urgency because it's about how we just have one weekend to maybe rekindle what was or what could be. Let's take advantage of that. Let's make this one weekend count while we have it. 'Tis the Damn Season. This is the moment. And now let's go to track 5, Tolerate It. This song really seems to be about a long-lasting relationship. With her songs about relationship turmoil, you can get a pretty clear sense of the kinds of relationships she's talking about. And usually they're like your typical boyfriend-girlfriend stuff. Maybe it's a fling. With Tolerate It, there's a lot of really interesting word choice, though, I think that lends itself to being a long, foundational relationship, pretty much like a marriage being sung about here. Lyrics like, I wake and watch you breathing, lay the table with the fancy shit, suggest that they live together. You're so much older and wiser. Where's that man who threw blankets over my barbed wire, suggesting they've been through good and bad times before? This really feels like it's about a marriage, or even a parent-child relationship. And since this is a track 5, we know that that's important to the theme. Taylor has said this track was inspired by feelings she herself has felt, maybe not an entire relationship she's been through, which I think makes sense because again, at least to our knowledge, she was never married, and at the time of writing this, she was still happy with Joe Alwyn. But I think the sense of time that we're establishing just naturally snuck its way into this song. So that Taylor's own feelings of, pulling from her past grew into a story of this marriage, or, whatever you want to call it. Ultimately, this song comes to a question rather than a conclusion, as with many of her track 5s. She pleads to know, is this frustration just all in my head? Is it true that you only tolerate my love? But that's it. Nothing else is done about the situation. She just continues in the way it is. Again, we get that sense of a very long-lasting grief that just doesn't go away. This idea that fate controls you instead of you controlling your fate. And I think what Taylor is doing is establishing that sometimes you just have these sad, unfair situations that you might just kind of have to live with. And many songs on this album tackle that exact idea from a grieving perspective. Coney Island and Champagne Problems, like I already mentioned. Happiness, quite literally about after a loss. Just sitting in those feelings, knowing that there was happiness, there will be happiness, and I just have to give it time. You just kind of have to wait it out. We do also, though, have songs that attempt to make the most out of bad situations in different ways. No Body, No Crime involves an murder. Ivy is an affair. Dorothea involves trying to get your ex to come back to you. All of these tracks are trying to do something now, trying to take control of their fate, but there's still a sense of uncertainty. Your ivy grows and now I'm covered in you. It's a sentiment of people taking an effect on you, whether you want them to or not, and you just kind of have to sit with it. Another song beautifully demonstrating that is Marjorie, detailing how Taylor lost her grandmother at a young age and thus felt like she didn't get enough time to truly appreciate her grandmother as she maybe would have now. Should have kept every grocery store receipt, cause every scrap of you would be taken from me. Again, people leaving that effect on you, but not giving you a chance to make it better. Closure is a song that then revels in that misery, whatever kind it might be. It's left intentionally vague because the focus is not on the relationship itself. It's on the sheer sentiment and feeling of not wanting closure. Almost like in Willow, how she wants this man to wreck her plans. Which is interesting, because not having closure truly can drive a person insane. I have felt it before. But here, she wants that insanity. She wants her spite and her beers and her candles. She wants to feel lonely and miserable. And I think that's indicative of the emphasis Taylor is putting on grief in this album, and how grief and longing and hope can distort you, but honestly, without those things, are we truly feeling? Are we even human anymore if we don't grieve and don't let ourselves sit with our own misery? I don't know, that's kind of a random tangent, but there is a deep sense of humanity here because after all, the thing that makes us most human is our mortality, is the end of our time on Earth.
All humans are aware of death, so we're all a little bit sad. All the time. That's just the deal.
And even more so, the fact that we don't have control over everything going wrong in our lives, even though we would like to. Things that are, one, very clearly explored in this album, two, very closely tied to escapism, the theme of folklore, and three, very clearly born out of the pandemic. Remember, this is still a pandemic album, and the pandemic not only was a time where people were isolated and wanted to escape, explored on folklore, but a time where people were grieving loss. People were dying. There was no control over it. People were getting sick, and we just had to literally wait it out and hope it was going to get better. Finally, we get to the closing track, Evermore, of course being the title, and I think that really kind of solidifies these ideas. Things being out of your control, fate, grief, and ultimately what it means to be human. It's set in this winter cabin where she's alone. She talks about all these things that are going wrong in her life, and how in those moments as she catches her breath, looks out the window, she just feels this eternal dread that she's never going to move on, that it's never going to get better. See how that ties into earlier tracks like Champagne Problems, Coney Island, Marjorie, all these tracks that sit in grief and loneliness and fear. Then we get this beautiful uplift in tempo as Bon Iver comes in with the bridge, laying out again more ways that things go wrong, but now kind of from an outside perspective. And then when Taylor comes back in this uplifting part, we hear her sing about getting up from that grief and loneliness and finding a way out. When I was shipwrecked, I thought of you. In the cracks of light, I dreamed of you. And that's how ultimately she ends on this note of this pain won't last forevermore. Whether she knows how, whether she knows why, she truly believes by the end of the song, she will move on. Things will get better. Not everything lasts forever. And that can be a good thing.
And then in the last chorus, the person goes inside and finally is warm and finally is safe. It's about sort of the process of finding hope again.
I also want to point out how the deluxe tracks here just play into the theme so perfectly, right where you left me, quite literally about being stuck somewhere forever, and then it's time to go, it's time to go, do I even need to say more? But yeah, I mean, it's hard to pull out an exact message, I think, by the end of this album, but very relevant to COVID, very relevant to grief and loneliness, things that she was probably feeling at this time, things everyone was feeling. And I think it's just so beautiful how it's explored in this album. Evermore has always been one of my favorite Taylor Swift albums, and it was always hard to explain and understand why I liked it more than folklore, but I think doing this analysis has opened my eyes as to why. It's because it has this deep emotional sense of being human, of being lonely, being confused even, and grieving. To not have control over your feelings and circumstances, but how to make it out of that despair anyways. The theme of this album, the resolution, is not to take control, but rather to revel in that loss of control, to accept it, and to know that things take time. You're gonna feel many times in your life that grief and loneliness will last evermore, but you kind of just have to wait it out. And I think the fact that we did make it out of COVID is a testament to that. I think we're going through another of those times right now. There's a huge loneliness epidemic, but listening to these albums, I think, is a great way for us to remind ourselves how we can make it out. And I think that's why these albums are just so revered within her discography, why fans love them, why non-fans love them, because it really is that profound. I think it's important to note as well that this was the moment where Taylor really became revered for her poeticism and her lyricism, why people started to see her as one of the greatest songwriters of our generation. Because you can't look at these albums and say this is bad songwriting. You cannot. I'm fine if you do that for her other albums. I can defend those in my own ways if I'd like. You cannot do that with these albums. These are truly testaments to the beauty of putting pen to paper. And so for anyone out there who wonders, why is she revered as this master songwriter, even though, her songwriting style has changed a bit since then, look no further than these albums. She still has retained elements of it. It's not like her songwriting has deteriorated by any means. Again, go back to my TTPD analysis video, but she's kind of returning to her roots as well, doing promotional cycles, and that's fine. And we will tackle that a bit more in part 4. I don't know how part 4 is going to work because I've already done a TTPD analysis, so it will really just be Midnights, but I might revisit TTPD. It might be shorter. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this analysis. I know it was kind of messy. I'm not going to lie. It was very hard to parse through these albums, but I think we have come to a good conclusion, and I'm excited to see you guys in the next one. Okay, bye!